We'll hear argument next today, case 17-7505, Madison versus Alabama. Mr. Stevenson.
Mr. Chief Justice, may it please the court. It's undisputed that Vernon Madison now sits on Alabama's death row, unable to fully orient to time and place. The authority to execute someone who is not an immediate threat is an awesome power. And that power has to be utilized fairly, reliably, and humanely.
For most of my career, I provided legal representation to people on death row. I've argued a bunch of cases before the United States Supreme Court, and each time I go, I stand there in front of the court. I read what it says about equal justice under law.
All right, thank you all very much. Thanks.
I have to believe that to make sense out of what I do. I've been thinking a lot recently about an incident that took place when I was a little boy. My mom saved up enough money for my sister and I to get on a church bus trip to the new Disney World that had just opened up. I remember being so excited about it because not only were we going to go to Disney World, we would be staying in a hotel, and the hotel would have a swimming pool. My sister and I had never been in a real swimming pool. As we pulled into the hotel, my sister started squealing. As soon as the bus stopped, she grabbed me, and we went streaking over to this pool. I grabbed her hand, and we jumped high in the air, and we landed in that pool, and it was as glorious as I had imagined it would be. It was just unbelievable. And we were having such fun, and then I realized that chaos had broken out around us. White parents were frantically running into the water, snatching their children violently out of the pool. And I was looking at my sister, trying to figure out what is going on. Finally, there was one little boy left in the pool, and this big guy came, he snatched him by the arm and lifted him out of the water. And the little boy started crying hysterically. I turned to that white man and I said, "What's wrong?" And he gave me this look and he said, "You're wrong, nigger." We got out of the pool and I ran to my mom, and when I told her what the man said, she looked at me and she said, "You get back in that pool." She said, "Don't you let those people run you from that pool." What I remember most vividly from that trip is getting back in the pool and standing in the corner of the pool, holding my sister's hand and desperately trying not to cry. What do you do with a memory like that? I still remember that. And the question becomes, do the white kids remember the day they were forced out of the pool by their parents because two black kids got into the water? Memory is powerful. It's a powerful force in the way a society evolves. We have a constitution that talks about equality, liberty, and justice for all. And for decades, for centuries, we tolerated enslavement of other human beings. We tolerated abuse and violence against people. We tolerated bigotry and discrimination. And in thinking about what it would take to move this court and this country to a place of greater resolve when it comes to eliminating bias and discrimination, it became clear to me that we haven't really talked much about the legacy of racial bias. I think there's a kind of smog in the air that's created by the history of slavery and lynching and segregation. And I don't think we're going to get healthy. I don't think we can be free until we address this problem. But to get there, we're gonna have to be willing to tell the truth.
You know, I was just going through my files a couple of days ago, and I actually had this pad that had notes of an interview I did with Rosa Parks. I had the great privilege of knowing Rosa Parks when I moved to Montgomery in the 1980s. As a young lawyer, I met an extraordinary woman who was the architect, really, of the Montgomery bus boycott. She was an amazing person. Her name was Johnny Carr. And Johnny Carr was a force to be reckoned with. And when I moved to Montgomery, Ms. Carr called me up and she said, "Bryan, I understand you're a young lawyer and you just moved to town." I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "When I call you up and ask you to do something, what you're going to do is you're going to say, 'Yes, ma'am.'" One day she called me up, she said, "Bryan, I want to tell you, Ms. Parks is coming back to town. So we're going to get together and we're going to talk. Do you want to come over and listen?" I said, "Oh, yes, ma'am." Yes, ma'am. And I listened to these women talk for 2 hours. They weren't talking about the things they had done. They were talking about the things they were still going to do. And finally, after 2 hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, "Now, Bryan, tell me about the Equal Justice Initiative. Tell me what you're trying to do." And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak. And she nodded, and so I gave her my whole rap. I said, "Ms. Parks, we're trying to end the death penalty. We're trying to do something about racial bias. We're trying to do something about the poor. We're trying to do something about conditions of confinement." And when I finished, she looked at me, she said, She said, "That's going to make you tired, tired, tired." And Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, "That's why you've got to be brave, brave, brave."
In 1989, we set up this project here in Montgomery, Alabama, to provide legal services to poor people, incarcerated people, condemned people on death row. Alabama doesn't have a public defender system, and there were just a lot of people desperate for help.
Alabama has the highest death sentencing rate in the country per capita. And I think, you know, from the very beginning, Bryan's sense was we should do as many cases as possible.
I think of a wrongful conviction as any conviction where the law has not been followed, where there have been illegal practices or policies. It doesn't mean that the person is innocent. We represent a lot of people who did the things they were accused of. But I think you can be properly convicted and unfairly sentenced. We're going to start moving because of limited time.
I think in law school I conceived of myself as becoming a great lawyer and winning cases that get people out of prison. And that is a huge part of what we do.
So I just wanted to get some reaction to that idea and make sure we were comfortable with that.
But I think you have to be more than a lawyer in the sort of technical sense.
I'd never met a lawyer, ever, until I got to law school, and my time in law school was frustrating because I didn't meet lawyers who seemed to represent something I wanted to do. And I tried to rationalize accepting a career as a lawyer that I knew was not going to be fulfilling. And it was frankly in the midst of that I went to Atlanta, Georgia, and spent a month with the Southern Prisoners Defense Committee. And for the first time, I met a lawyer who seemed to represent something that excited me.
I do think that the issue before us is how the death penalty works in practice. And the fact of the matter is the death penalty, and I practice in the death belt states of the South, and the evidence is undeniable that the death penalty is a result of race, poverty, politics, and the passions of the moment.
One thing that's immediately apparent with the death penalty in the South is that it's about race and place. You see lots of changes in the Deep South. But when you go to the courthouse, nothing has changed. It's like we're back in 1940 or 1950. The judge is white, the prosecutors are white, the court-appointed lawyers are white. And even in communities that have fairly substantial African-American populations, the jury will be all white. So the only person of color in the front of the courtroom is the person on trial.
You see that smoke coming out of, boy? Yeah. Woo. Oh, looking porty. The secret to a cookout. Always have you a taste master. That's my taste master right there. He gonna let me know if it's right. Oh, wait till it tastes.
It's good, Mr. Henry, right on time.
To me, life was good. Not a care in the world, just trying to get up every morning and put one foot forward and do the best you can and just enjoy life. It was just good to be who I was at that particular time. At least that's what I thought. I found myself in a situation that I never should have been in. I was 29 years old. Woke up like any morning, ate breakfast, and my mom asked me to go out there and cut that grass. About 15 to 20 minutes into cutting the grass, I just happened to look up. And there stood two white gentlemen at the edge of the back porch. I cut the lawnmower off and I said, "Can I help you?" And one of them replied, "We are detective from the Birmingham Police Department." And I said, "Okay, how can I help you?" And he said, "Well, we have a warrant for your arrest." On our way to jail, the detective turned around and asked me, "Anthony, do you own a pistol?" And I said, "No." He said, "Do your mother own a firearm?" I said, "No." "Yes." I said, "She owned an old .38 Smith & Wesson." My mom gave him the pistol. I asked him, he take it at least 50 times. Why am I being arrested? Never would respond. I asked him again for the 51st time, why am I being arrested? He said, "You want to know why we arresting you?" He said, "You robbed a restaurant manager and you killed him." I said, "You got the wrong person. I ain't done none of that." He said, "Let me tell you something right now. I don't care whether you did it or didn't do it. There's 5 things that are going to convict you." He said, "Number 1, you black. Number 2, a white man is going to say you shot him. Number 3, you're going to have a white prosecutor. Number 4, you're going to have a white judge. And number 5, you're going to have an all-white jury." And he said, "Do you know what that spells? Conviction." And sure enough, they found me guilty. The judge said, "Anthony Ray Hinton, it is the order of this court that I sentence you to death. May God have mercy on your soul."
The Supreme Court was urged today to strike down the death penalty because it is applied unequally to black and white.
It was 8 years ago that arrests were made for the murder of a white Atlanta policeman during a holdup at a furniture store. The man convicted of pulling the trigger was Warren McCleskey. He was sentenced to die in Georgia's electric chair. The appeal was based on death row studies showing that those who kill whites are 11 times more likely to be sentenced to die than those who kill blacks.
We'll hear arguments first this morning in number 84-6811, Warren McCleskey versus Ralph Kemp.
Once I got involved in representing people on death row, it was McCleskey that began to illuminate the ways in which our history of racial inequality was limiting the commitment of the rule of law and disadvantaging people of color. What was surprising is that the United States Supreme Court didn't question the data. The court said, even though we believe you, we're not going to strike down the death penalty because a certain amount of bias in the administration of the death penalty is, in our opinion, quote, inevitable. And as a young lawyer working on that case, that was a real crisis. It felt like the court was abandoning the commitment to equal justice. It was abandoning the commitment to racial equality.
I believe that there is a presumption, at least in southern states, that Georgia prosecutors juries and district attorneys cannot fairly and impartially administer the death penalty. And I'd like to tell you that it's not 1950 anymore. We can fairly and impartially administer the laws as narrowly drawn under our Constitution.
Mr. Stevenson, do you have a question?
What has changed that allows you to support or assert that the death penalty is being fairly applied now in ways that it wasn't being applied in 1950?
First of all, as I'm sure you know, Mr. Stevenson, we have more white persons incarcerated on death row for murders than we do for black people. So
how does that disprove that race is not a factor? The bottom line is that only 27% of the population of Georgia is black. Yet 75% of the people that have been executed in that state are African American. That's 25% more than the people who committed murders, and it's 50% more than the people who exist in that state.
So do you want an answer to your question, or do you want to tell me your statistics?
I want an answer to a question, but I want an honest answer.
Your point of view is that no person who is a black person in Georgia can get a fair trial according to you. You want to go into generalized statistics because you cannot face the fact as an attorney that there are people who should be held accountable of their actions regardless of their race.
Mr. Glasser.
The court in McCleskey said that he failed because he didn't prove intentional discrimination on the part of each of the decision makers in his case. And we started thinking about that. It was like, well, how do you prove that? Well, we need to start asking questions about the decision makers. So we started asking questions of judges. Have you ever used the N-word? Have you ever hired people of color to be clerks? Did you pull your kids out of the schools when integration came? And the same questions were appropriate for the prosecutor. And no one wanted to answer those questions. I was persuaded, and still am, that the criminal justice system revealed the problems of our history of bias against the poor and people of color, unlike few systems did.
In the state of Georgia, when a black defendant is sentenced to death, and 4 of the 12 jurors who sentenced him say that the Ku Klux Klan do good things in that community, when that defense lawyer says that I believe my client is genetically predisposed to commit violent crimes and that's why I'm comfortable with his death sentence, when the trial judge and the prosecutor refer to that black defendant as colored boy throughout the trial, that's racial bias.
Okay. And Ms. Bowling, would you like to?
I think of McCleskey as a critical moment in the court's relationship to not only the rule of law and the Constitution, but to race. I had a hard time reconciling this commitment to equal justice under law with this doctrine of inevitability. And what that ruling meant is that not only was there not going to be an end to the death penalty, it meant that Warren McCleskey would likely be executed. And I've had some hard moments, but that stands out. It created a sort of injury. An execution date was scheduled, and Warren McCleskey was executed. We are haunted in America by our history of racial inequality. For me, it actually begins with the fact that we're a post-genocide society. I think what happened to Native people on this continent was a genocide. We forced these communities from land through war and violence. We didn't call it a genocide because we said, no, these Native people are different. They're a different race. And we use this narrative of racial difference to justify the abuse, the exploitation, the destruction of these communities. And that narrative of racial difference is what then made slavery in America so problematic. And you cannot understand slavery in America without understanding the role that the United States Supreme Court played in making slavery acceptable, making slavery moral, making slavery legal. Slave owners in the American South wanted to feel like they were moral people. They were Christians. And to feel that and still be owning other people, they had to say that black people are different than white people. And that was ratified by the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court says in 1857, look, black people are an inferior race. They're not like white people. They're 3/5 human. And because of that, they're not citizens. They are not protected by the Constitution. And that decision not only allowed slavery to persist, but it created a racial hierarchy. It introduced formally in the law this idea of white supremacy, this narrative of racial difference. We then had this bloody civil war. The North prevails. We passed the 13th Amendment, which ends involuntary servitude and forced labor. We passed the 14th Amendment, which is supposed to provide equal protection. We passed the 15th Amendment, which is supposed to give people the right to vote. And the reaction to that in many parts of this country was violent. In 1873, in Colfax, Louisiana, 150 black people are murdered by a white mob because they were protesting their inability to be politically represented. Congress says, we can't allow that kind of violence. We're going to have our federal prosecutors prosecute those people for that violence. And white people are convicted. And the United States Supreme Court says, no, Congress doesn't have the authority to prevent that kind of violent intimidation. States have rights, and the federal government can't impinge on those rights. So this era, I think, does something significant to the credibility, the integrity of the United States Supreme Court. It became a tool for sustaining racial violence, white supremacy, and exploitation of black people.
We have dedicated ourselves firmly to the belief that the best interests of both races may be served by segregated schools.
When the 1940s and 50s come along and black people begin organizing and protesting and challenging this legal architecture of bigotry and discrimination, the states use the same rhetoric they've been using since the Civil War.
There's nothing in the Constitution of the United States that says anything about education or schools. The states authorize them, and the states support them, and the states control them.
States say we can treat black people any way we want to, and the federal government can't do anything about it because we have states' rights. And that narrative was given to them by the United States Supreme Court.
This is in part of the group of lawyers from all sections of the country who are here in the Supreme Court for the purpose of arguing the school segregation cases. We believe that the proper place for the issue of segregation is in a court.
When Brown versus Board of Education is decided, when the court makes this ruling that segregation in education is unconstitutional, it's a watershed moment. It was finally the court not yielding to bigotry and bias and exclusion and discrimination. And so for them to declare in 1987 in McCleskey versus Kemp that they were retreating, that these problems are, quote, inevitable, it was heartbreaking. I went to law school because I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I started my education in a colored school. It was that commitment from lawyers to come into communities like mine that made it possible for me to go to a high school and to get to college.
So that's where my grandparents used to live. They've fixed it up, actually. And this is all the kind of the black section of Georgetown back in here. This was the segregated school for black kids. And that was where school ended. When my dad was a kid, it could take you to the 6th or 8th grade. But after that, there was no more school. So if you wanted to go to high school, you had to leave the county. And this is the little church I grew up in, Prospect A&B Church. My dad had lived with segregation his whole life,
had been taught to not draw attention to yourself, not do anything that's going to get you at risk. It was a coping mechanism that was necessary living in the community where we lived. My dad was strategic and tactical. My mom could be strategic and tactical too, but she was also prepared to react. And that reaction sometimes would create some tension. If you went to the store clerks were always white. And what they would do in those days is the store clerks would put your change down on the table. They wouldn't put it in your hand. They didn't want to touch a black person. She would say, "That's my money, you have to give it to me." And I just think for her, it was hard to stay silent. You know, when I went to law school at Harvard, to be honest, I felt vulnerable. I worried that I didn't belong there. I was around people who could talk about how for 3 generations, their family members had been lawyers or doctors. And I didn't want anybody to know that I started my education in a colored school. I didn't want people to know that my great-grandparents were enslaved. But then going to death row, seeing that struggle made manifest, I realized that the things I had been silent about are the things that I should be talking about.
Bryan, when we've watched him argue in court, I took both of my sons to watch him argue at the Supreme Court, I can see my mother in him. But my parents didn't always agree on what Bryan was doing. You know, Bryan, if they did something wrong, why are you defending them? The fear was initially that when Bryan started in Montgomery, they were getting a lot of bomb threats.
I have the trepidation of someone trying to harm him. I feel that in the back of my spirit to be protective of him because people don't like what he has to say or things that he's done.
Bryan's heart for this work became evident very early on. My father wanted him to make a lot of money. I said, I don't think he's gonna have that kind of job. I mean, you know, Bryan's not gonna be that kind of lawyer. But they came around because when they would meet the folks that he was working with and see how their life changed, that looked more like church. They familiar with that.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
It's so good to see you.
Great to see you too. I used to play testimonial services before. When I was a little tiny, they didn't trust me for the main service yet. So I would sit up there and they say, "You can play testimonial." And people would stand up in these pews and they would give their testimonies. And I talk about this all the time. A lot of times they'd be talking about how difficult things had been. Mm-hmm. They'd talk about how they maybe didn't have enough food to feed their families or something hard had happened. But at the end of it, they'd start singing, "But it wouldn't take nothing from a journey now." You know, and I'd catch that key and things would just pick up, and it was so formative for a lot of what I'm trying to do now. And so this is a precious place to me. It's a special place. It's a formative place for all of us, me and my family. And so it's good to be back in here.
People who have a warrant that says at some point you will be strapped down and put to death, that those people have the most compelling need for legal assistance of anybody in our society. Not only is the work to represent them, but to also minister to that person, to comfort that person, to support that person and that person's family. We are going to be able to get some people over to safe passage, but there are going to be other people that's not going to happen.
On December 16, 1986, they transported me to Holman Correction Facility, where they housed death row inmates. When I got convicted, the prosecution ran out that day and told the media that the state of Alabama got the worst killer that ever walked the streets in Birmingham off the streets that day. Only wasn't true. When I got there, they was in the process of executing 4 men. Thursday night is the night they execute you. Never forget the smell. And I asked the guard, I said, is there anything you can give me to keep me from smelling that smell? The guard looked at me and he said, no, but you'll get used to it. And by the way, one day, somebody will smell your flesh too. How can another human being tell another person that?
In many ways, you can say that the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. If the urgent narrative that we're trying to deal with in this country is a narrative of racial difference, the narrative that we have to overcome is a narrative of white supremacy, the South prevailed. And that's what we were dealing with at the beginning of the 20th century, when we began an era where white supremacy, racial subordination, racial hierarchy is going to be enforced in a new way. Lynching. Thousands of people pulled out of their homes, burned alive, mutilated, tortured, hanged, shot, drowned, sometimes in plain view in front of thousands of people. Sometimes the mob would drag them through the Black community, force people out of their homes to see the brutalized body of one of their neighbors, one of their loved ones. And oftentimes, a Black person who had been lynched, their body would be suspended on a bridge or on a tree. And family members couldn't retrieve that body, sometimes for days. The sheriff would actually post someone to make sure that the body was still there days later. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't something that the Klan did. The people who perpetrated these lynchings weren't people wearing white hoods. There was no need to wear a hood. You could actually pose with the victim's body. You could carve their body up and collect souvenirs. This was actually a point of pride. Everybody was complicit. And lynchings were largely taking place in communities where there was a functioning criminal justice system. But there was this idea that Black people weren't good enough to even be criminal defendants. And Black people were lynched not just for some accusation of murder or rape. They were often lynched because of some social transgression. Not saying sir to a white person could get you lynched. Going to the front door rather than the back door could get you lynched. Interracial romance was the most incendiary. It was terrorism in the most complete sense. These acts of violence were intended to terrorize people into not challenging, not resisting, not confronting this racial hierarchy. And in that sense, these lynchings weren't just about those individuals. This was about the entire African American community. I do think for African American families in the American South, it was impossible to not have a story about the violence and terror. My grandfather witnessed a lynching. He told me about seeing the mob, them dragging someone to a spot, him running to hide, him looking through this little slat in a building and watching this violence. The thing that he would talk about was knowing so many of these people. And that creates this challenge of how you live in a community where you have to pretend to trust people who you know are capable of engaging in the kind of terror and violence that a lynching represents.
I've actually been representing people on death row for about 31 years. Walter Mcmillian was wrongly convicted and condemned to death in Monroe County, Alabama, which is about an hour and 45 minutes south of here. Monroeville is the community where Harper Lee grew up and wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. And if you've ever been to Monroe County, it's a community that loves talking about To Kill a Mockingbird. And yet, in the late 1980s, a black man was wrongly convicted and sentenced to death for a crime he did not commit.
You didn't kill Rhonda
No,
Martin?
sir. I ain't never seen Rhonda Martin a day in my life. God knows I ain't.
Where were you on the day of the murder?
At my house.
Did you ever go into Monroeville on the day of the murder?
No, sir.
You never went into town?
Never went to Monroeville, period.
There was a murder that took place in downtown Monroeville. The police couldn't solve the crime. The pressure got so great on the police that I believe they decided to arrest someone even though they knew that person wasn't guilty. And the person they chose to arrest was Walter Mcmillian. We believe they chose to arrest him because he was a black man who had had an interracial affair.
What did he say?
With a young white woman.
They told me that I was going to prison because of that nigger, and they didn't understand why I wanted to mess with niggers.
The trial lasted a day and a half. The jury actually returned a verdict of life imprisonment without parole, but in Alabama, our elected trial judges have the authority to override jury verdicts of life and impose the death penalty. And what happened in this case is that the elected judge, whose name was Robert E. Lee Key, I know you think I'm making that up, but that's true, overrode the jury's verdict of life and imposed the death penalty. I got involved in the case, and we came up with some very dramatic evidence of Mr. Mcmillian's innocence. I have never had a case where the state's only evidence of guilt comes from one person. It turned out that the man that they got to testify against him, they had coerced him to testify falsely. And for some very bizarre reason, which I'll never understand, they tape recorded the sessions where they were coercing him to testify falsely.
Why should anyone believe you now? Right is right, and wrong is wrong. And for a man to straighten his own life out, he must tell the truth.
What lawyers are doing in cases on behalf of their clients is telling their stories. We have to find out what that story is, we have to document it, and then we have to tell it in as compelling a way that we can.
It was so clear that they had violated the law in so many ways. But when we presented the evidence in court, the court ruled against us. This was a case that generated a lot of strong feelings. I got death threats during this case. And then we appealed the case. And ultimately, we were able to save Walter Mcmillian from execution. For me, the innocence cases are the hardest cases. I think people think of that the other way. They think, oh, it must be great to work on a case where there's clear evidence of innocence. But I know that our system is capable of executing innocent people, of turning a blind eye.
The injustices in these cases literally jump out at you when you look at them. The race discrimination, the trial by ambush, in many of these cases, the terrible quality of lawyers that many people who are sentenced to death get, so that really their trial is just a legal lynching.
By the 1930s and 40s, there is a growing anti-lynching movement. And eventually, the strategy was adopted that we're going to end mob lynching by telling the mob that we'll do it for you. We'll do it indoors. You don't have to do it outdoors. The reliability of these proceedings, the fairness of these proceedings didn't get much better. You have these show trials that last 6 or 7 hours. And the same outcome. We're going to execute this person. And you see the numbers start to rise of legal execution, but in communities of color, it's just legal lynching. People don't realize that the case that mobilized Rosa Parks and Dr. King here in Montgomery was not the bus boycott. It was actually the arrest of a young teen who was wrongly accused of a rape, who was taken to death row, put in the electric chair, and forced to confess. And then they used that to convict him and sentence him to death. And Rosa Parks was outraged, and Dr. King was outraged, and they started asking the governor and other people to intervene. And after a couple of years of that advocacy, they were told not going to do anything. And that young man was executed. And the pain of that was part of the story that then gave rise to the civil rights movement. But it was about this continuum of presuming Black people guilty and dangerous no matter what the evidence. It was about the way our criminal justice system functions. It was about lynching and its legacy.
We farmed, used to farm all that land back there. Boy, we used to farm the land, used to plow with a mule. My mama and the older brothers and things. Then when I got older, I took over, and my other brother, he took over. That kept generation and kept going. We did people plant a lot of cotton around here.
Walter Mcmillian was born in a region of Alabama that had been part of the plantation economy. When emancipation came, these formerly enslaved people became sharecroppers and tenant farmers. And that's what his family did. They didn't own the land they lived on. It was brutal, difficult life.
I started working about I think I was somewhere around about 7, 8 years old, something like that.
When Mr. Mcmillian got out of prison, he wanted to just resume his life. But he was never able to get fully settled. He came and lived with me for a while. He lived with his daughter. He lived with his sister. I think he was traumatized by his time on death row. And I don't think there was really any way to fully recover from that.
See, you just be thinking about, you always got to be looking back all the time. You know this man done this to you, and he might do it again. It's rough, I'm telling you.
It didn't take long before the burden of his incarceration began to manifest itself with dementia. He began to show symptoms of a kind of dementia that many doctors link with trauma. I think that our history of lynching casts a shadow over the modern death penalty. And the cases of people like Walter Mcmillian show the power of that shadow to be destructive. We've now had 156 people proved innocent after being sentenced to death. With less than 1,500 executions, that means that for every 10 people that we executed, we've now proved one innocent person on death row. It's a shocking rate of error. Well, we tolerate that error because we have a consciousness that says what happens to those people isn't really that bad. It's the same consciousness that allowed us to tolerate thousands of lynchings. And to understand the consciousness that would give rise to that, you have to remember how the courts had created this idea that these Black people are not people. They're not fully human. And so in that sense, you can't disconnect the death penalty from the legacy of lynching. And you can't disconnect the legacy of lynching from the era of enslavement. I think that this line is a very real one. And if we don't recognize that line, we're not going to see the way that line will continue to claim lives unfairly. For me, music is therapy. It's a place to go. It's the only thing I do that takes me completely out of my head. Like when I try to exercise or something, I'm still processing things. But when I play, usually, I'm not thinking about anything. And so for me, it's been a real comfort, a real aid in managing the challenges that the kind of work we do can create.
Bryan is the work. There's no way to separate him from the work. It's his full self that he pours into it. He's gone on a path that almost nobody else would have chosen. And he's done it at times that have been incredibly lonely.
After a long day, he's getting calls, multiple calls every night from clients in prison who have his home phone number. Some of these folks don't have family members, and there's no one in the world. On a Sunday morning, when most of us are taking a break, he'll call me from the road. He'll be driving to a prison to see an old client. You know, the client doesn't need a legal visit. It's just basically, he's just as a friend going to visit somebody just so they can get a visit.
For the most part, he's on a go. I always say to him in a mother voice, you know, eat, rest your body, take time for yourself. You know, Howard and Bryan, we don't see each other as much as we should. We have a bond and a connection. It feels always right. And when we do get together, it's wonderful. Oh, no, you didn't. That's a good one.
My oldest son, Bryan, who's named after his uncle, his mother and I kind of agreed that we thought Bryan might not have time for a family. And one of the reasons we named him after his uncle was envisioning him just always working and sacrificing that.
Let's do a Stevie Wonder song. The kids know. Oh, no.
I used to worry about it all the time. You know, needing his own downtime, his own family, his own space. But he's convinced us that he's good.
I want to grow up and be a designer.
Oh, beautiful.
Scientist, inventor, adventurer, game maker.
That's a lot.
And the richest and most famous man in the world. Besides you.
Oh, wow. Well, you'll definitely be able to be richer, that's for sure.
I've never really spent a lot of time thinking about what I don't have. There are times, obviously, when you feel like you have a different life. I have a different life. You have a different situation. I love children. I love my nieces and my nephews and all of that. But it never feels to me, it's never felt like a sacrifice. It just feels like, you know, I have the opportunity to do these amazing things with amazing people. And I feel really privileged to do that.
I wrote Mr. Stevenson a letter. I said, Mr. Stevenson, I would like for you to become my lawyer, but before you say yes or no, all I ask is that you read my transcript. I said, and if you find one thing in my transcript that points to my guilt, do not worry about becoming my lawyer.
When I met Anthony Ray Hinton, years after we'd won freedom for Walter Mcmillian, it was very sobering for me because he was actually on death row before Walter Mcmillian. Walter did 6 years on death row before he was released. Mr. Hinton had already been on death row for 14 years before I met him. And the evidence of his innocence was just as dramatic. So we immediately start working on the case.
Mr. Stevenson will be equally as lenient on the time considerations of your argument.
Thank you, Chief Judge Mcmillian. I represent the petitioner in this matter, Anthony Ray Hinton. Let me first start out by saying that this is an extraordinary case. We have alleged in the court below, as we have represented to this court, that Mr. Hinton is innocent.
I said, Mr. Stevenson, if no two guns are alike, I said, I know that the state of Alabama is telling a lie. I said, I need you to hire a ballistic expert. And I said, I need you to get a Southern white man. I said, all of my life I lived in the South and I know how the South works. I said, they only gonna believe one of their own. I need that Southern white man to just tell the truth.
We have now alleged that we have done testing by some of the best experts in this country that established that there is no match between this weapon and the projectiles.
Once we got involved and we were able to get the best gun experts in the country to look at the evidence, and they quickly concluded that this gun was not the weapon that was used in these murders, we thought we could get a quick resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. I'd like to thank both counsel for your excellent presentations. At this time, the court will be in recess for 5 minutes.
All right.
We took this new evidence to the Attorney General, whose name at that time was Bill Pryor, and asked him to re-examine the bullets. His staff was quoted as saying it would be a waste of the taxpayer money and it would be a waste of his time. And although it would only take 1 hour, that is 1 hour that he was not willing to take. And for not doing his job, George W. Bush appointed him to a federal lifetime appointment. 16 years went by, 3 different attorney generals. My life was not worth 1 hour. My life was not worth the truth.
There would be a lot of times when the weight of all of this would get to both of us. You know, you keep hoping that this is going to be the month and we'd get a ruling, and it wasn't the ruling we needed. And I just think your capacity to maintain hope in the face of such irrational resistance is challenged. You know, there'd be days when he'd say, I don't know how much longer I can do this. And year after year went by.
There's a huge difference between law and justice. Law says that if a person misses a deadline by a day, even though it's an innocent mistake, that person is going to be denied any relief in the court. That's not justice. Justice would say, let's look and see what happened and do the right thing.
The most difficult thing, at least for me, is I can, file motions, I can appeal losses, I can challenge your conviction, challenge your sentence. That's what I have to offer as a lawyer. But then ultimately, no court agrees with you that there's an injustice in the case and your client gets executed. It actually happened to 3 of my clients in a row, all within a 1-year period. You want to just lean out the window and scream, does anyone see what's happening here?
In 2009, we got involved in a case of a man who didn't have a lawyer, who was scheduled to be executed in 30 days. This was after the court had ruled in Atkins versus Virginia that you can't execute the intellectually disabled. And it turned out this man did suffer from intellectual disability. So I went to the trial court and said, you can't execute him. But the trial court said, too late. Somebody should have raised that years ago. I went to the state court, they said too late. The appeals court said too late. The federal court said too late. We got to the day of the execution, and I was waiting on a ruling from the United States Supreme Court. Finally, the call came, and the ruling was that our motion for a stay of execution was due to be denied. And I then had to do the hardest thing I do in my job. I got on the phone, and I told this man, I'm so sorry, but I can't stop this execution. And then the man did the thing that I dread the most in my work. He started to cry. And then he tried to say something to me. But in addition to being intellectually disabled, he had a speech impediment, and he began to stutter. And in this moment, he kept trying to say something, and he just couldn't get a word out. And I didn't know what to say. I just was holding the phone. And my mind began to wander. And I remembered going to church one Sunday when I was a little boy. My mom had taken me to church. I remembered being in church, talking to my friends, and seeing this little skinny kid I'd never seen before. I asked that little boy, I said, "What's your name? Where are you from?" And I remembered how that little boy also couldn't get his words out, and he started to stutter. And then I remembered I laughed. And my mom saw me laughing at this little boy, and she came over and she grabbed me by the arm and she pulled me aside. And she said, "Bryan, don't you ever do that. Now you go back over there and you tell that little boy you're sorry. After you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy. After you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him." And on the night of this execution, what I remembered was walking over to this little boy and saying, "Look, man, I'm sorry." And then I remembered lunging at him and giving him my little boy version of a man hug. And then I remember trying to say to this child as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, "Look, man, I don't know, I love you." And what I'd forgotten was how that little boy hugged me back. And then I remembered how he whispered flawlessly in my ear, he said, "I love you too." I was holding the phone and tears were running down my face. Finally, my client got his words out. He said, "Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for representing me." And then he said, "I want to thank you for fighting for me." And the last thing that man said to me, he said, "Mr. Stevenson, I love you for trying to save my life." He hung up the phone, they pulled him away, they strapped him to a gurney, and they executed him. I hung up the phone, I said, "I can't do this anymore." I was sitting there in agony, thinking about why I do what I do. I kept thinking about how broken he was. My clients have been broken by poverty, broken by disability, broken by trauma, broken by bias and discrimination. But what I realized that night that I'd never realized before is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. People sometimes say to me, "Oh, it must be overwhelming and difficult to represent people on death row, to be fighting against the system," and it is. The truth is that if you stand next to the condemned, if you fight for the poor, if you push against systems that are rooted and heavy, if you keep pushing and you keep fighting and you keep doing, you're going to get broken. What I realized is that I am part of the broken community. And when you realize that, you don't have a choice in standing up for the rights of the other broken. And so when I feel overwhelmed, I go into the conference room and I look out the window and I think about the people who were working here 60 years ago, trying to just create more justice. Sometimes I go to Dexter, Dr. King's church. We're at the heart, even the birthplace of the modern civil rights movement. And the images that we like to show of Dr. King are him giving these brilliant speeches about the moral arc of the universe. But the image that I think best captures his courage is the image of him in a Montgomery police station with his arm being pulled violently behind his back, where he's being arrested because he has organized a protest against racial segregation.
Just the other day, one of the fine citizens of our community, Mrs. Rosa Parks, was arrested because she refused to give up her seat for a white passenger.
When you look at our history when it comes to race, order is a defining characteristic. Every time it seems that people of color have some moment of progress, there is a reaction against that. And the reaction is usually to criminalize and use the criminal justice system to reshape, redefine what's just happened. So when people start protesting, what do? We call them criminals. Dr. King is convicted of a crime for organizing the Montgomery bus boycott. That frame is a constant frame in American history. That's what gave rise to convict leasing. What happens in the 1870s when Reconstruction collapses is that states immediately begin criminalizing all kinds of conduct by black people that they would never criminalize for white people. Oh, if 6 black people are together after dark, that's a crime. If black people try to get a job without a letter from their former slave owner, that's a crime. They start arresting people of color and convicting them of these made-up crimes, and they were leased to commercial entities. It was a new kind of enslavement. The label slave is replaced with the label criminal. But it created the same ability to oppress and to control. Using crime and criminality has been an effective tool throughout. So in the 1950s and 60s, when people start protesting and marching, they're criminalized. And it is the criminal justice system, it is those who wear uniforms that become the foot soldiers of this effort to sustain racial inequality.
When the nation with the greatest tradition of the rule of law is plagued by unprecedented lawlessness, then it's time for new leadership for the United States of America.
When Richard Nixon claims power, he uses the same trope. We've got to have law and order.
And to those who say that law and order is a code word for racism, our goal is justice. Justice for every American.
Law hasn't been involved in no burglary.
As we move into the 1970s, everybody is talking about getting tough on crime. And we commit now to build a new institution that will operate that control, and we're going to call it mass incarceration. And the prison population begins to grow. We go from 300,000 in 1972 to 2.3 million today. We become the society with the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We've allowed the criminal justice system to be the repository of what we do with our rage, our anger, our frustration when we've had moments of progress with regard to civil rights and racial justice. We do it to everybody. We do it to women. The percentage of women going to jails and prisons has increased 646% over the last 25 years. We do it to children. We began lowering the minimum age for trying children as adults. We did it to the mentally ill, people with disabilities. We spent $6 billion on jails and prisons in 1980, $80 billion last year. And the people who profit from that industry have a perverse incentive to make sure no one is released. And the more people we incarcerate, the more money they make. And it's not unlike the economic dynamic that allowed us to keep enslaving people. It's the reason why this statistic about 1 in 3 black male babies going to jail or prison is an indictment on this country and our failure to recognize this historical legacy. My grandparents were from Caroline County, Virginia. But in the early 20th century, they, along with lots of other black people, went north and ended up in Philadelphia. And that's where my mother was raised. My grandfather ended up living in the projects in South Philadelphia. And when he was 86 years old, some young kids broke in and tried to steal his TV. And he said no, and he was stabbed to death. He was a murder victim. I was 16 years old. I saw the pain and anguish that created in our family. The question we asked was why? Why did this happen? Why would these young kids act like that? When I go into poor communities and I sit down with young boys and I try to have an honest conversation with them, they'll say, Mr. Stevenson, I know I'm going to be in prison by the time I'm 21. Because they're living in communities where 80% of the young men of color end up in jail or prison. And so they say to me, Mr. Stevenson, I've got to go out here and get mine while I can. But a bigger question is, why was my grandfather in South Philadelphia living in the projects in his mid-80s? And that has a lot to do with this history. It has a lot to do with the era of lynching. It's why 6 million Black people fled the American South in the first half of the 20th century. One of the largest mass migrations in world history. The Black people in Cleveland, the Black people in Chicago, the Black people in Detroit, in Los Angeles, in Philadelphia, in Boston, in New York, came to these communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. Those communities have never been given the opportunity to recover in the way that I think they should. And that creates conditions today that are very problematic. What's happening to too many of our children in these communities where people fled from violence and terror is that they're still being terrorized.
Yeah, no guns this time.
They live in violent neighborhoods, they go to violent schools, and by the time they're 5, they actually have a trauma disorder. Threat and menace becomes a defining reality in the lives of these children. And when you're constantly dealing with that year after year after year, at the age of 8, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I got a drug, why don't you try this? And for the first time in your life, you have 3 hours where you don't feel threatened and menaced. What do you want? You want more of that drug. And if somebody at 10 or 11 says, hey man, why don't you join our gang? We're gonna help you fight all of these forces that are threatening and menacing you. And you say, yeah. Instead of seeing that choice as a choice that that's a bad kid, we ought to see that choice as a choice of a larger problem. We've got 13 states in this country with no minimum age for trying a child as an adult. I've represented 9 and 10-year-old kids facing 60 and 70-year prison sentences. We started putting 13-year-old children in prison with sentences of life imprisonment without parole. We condemned them to die at 13 and 14.
I came to this work through the death penalty. And so I think I felt that I emotionally was prepared for anything. One of the first cases I worked on with the young teenager, I went and drove to a county jail after hearing from a relative that they had a nephew who'd been arrested, charged with a felony, was being held in the adult prison. I got there, and there was this 14-year-old African-American kid in the hallway, chained to a pole in an enormous orange jumpsuit that was so big for him, it was completely covering his hands. And I remember just the sight of all of these people coming and going around him. Just completely unaffected by that. It's the first time I remember being in a prison and really having to dig my nails into myself to prevent myself from crying.
In 2005, a case called Roper versus Simmons, the Supreme Court struck down the death penalty for children. Alabama had one of the largest juvenile populations on death row that when that decision came down and we started talking with them about the fact that they weren't going to be executed, I think some of us expected joy and relief. But what we got instead was, I'm just getting a different kind of death sentence. I'm going to die in prison through incarceration rather than execution. It made us start to think more critically about the propriety of a death in prison sentence for any child. We impose life without parole on people we think will never change, are beyond redemption and hope. All children change, they grow. And to condemn them any point during that process seems unfair.
The Supreme Court heard arguments today about the propriety of imposing life sentences on some of the country's youngest criminals for crimes that do not involve murder. Do they belong behind bars forever, or should they have a chance someday at freedom?
The cases before the court today were both from Florida, a defendant who was 13 when he raped a 72-year-old woman, and a 16-year-old who committed armed burglary and assault.
We're very hopeful that we can create the kind of jurisprudence that sentences children rationally and appropriately. And we concede that some kids were going to have to be punished and have to be sent to prison, but we don't believe that any child, particularly a child of 13, should ever be condemned to die in prison. And we'll wait to see what the court says.
What about the argument that you don't know what the child's going to become?
Well, I think that's right. We don't know, but we do know that when we intervene with children, our chance of success is so much greater than when we intervene with adults, which is why we shouldn't condemn children in the way that we condemn adults. My brother colleague is here, and I'll turn things over to him at this point.
One of Bryan's great gifts is to be able to see how you can take one body of law and apply it somewhere else. He used the death penalty law and started challenging these life without parole sentencings for children. That no matter what somebody does, you have to take into account their youthfulness, their lack of maturity, lack of judgment, and all those things in trying to come up with a sentence that's proportionate to the crime.
We challenged life without parole for kids who had been convicted of non-homicide offenses. And then we challenged mandatory life without parole sentences for any child, where the court doesn't even consider the fact that we're talking about a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old. And we won these cases at the US Supreme Court. To punish people constitutionally, we have to be committed to fairness, we have to be committed to reliability, and we have to be committed to punishments that are humane. Because how we punish, how we treat the disfavored, the marginalized, the poor, the condemned, the incarcerated, doesn't just say something about them, it says something about us too. I really believe it's the broken among us that can teach us the way compassion is supposed to work. It's the broken that can teach us the way mercy is supposed to work. It's the broken that can show us the power of redemption and justice.
We want to thank all of you all for being here. This is a very, very happy day. It's a tragic day, too, because Mr. Hinton has spent 30 years locked in a 5x8 cell where the state of Alabama tried to kill him every day. His case, in my judgment, is a case study in what's wrong with our system. He was convicted because he's poor. We have a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent, and his case proves it. We have a system that is compromised by racial bias, and his case proves it. We have a system that doesn't do the right thing when the right thing is apparent. Prosecutors should have done these tests years ago, and they didn't, and that's a shame.
One day, Bryan came to the prison. He said, "Ray, the judges in Alabama is not going to do the right thing. I want to take your case to the United States Supreme Court. 2 years later, the United States Supreme Court did something that it have never done in the history of the court. All 9 judges ruled that I was entitled to a new trial.
Right before Mr. Hinton was released, we were talking. He was telling me, I can't hate people. I don't want to stay in a prison when I leave here. He said, it's gonna be hard, but I think I've actually decided that I'm going to forgive.
Every day I have to live with the fact that I lost 30 years of my life. The system, some people would say, it worked because you got out. And to those people I say, if the system had worked, I never would have went in.
To the west and to the east, to the north and to the south.
I'm not so much worried about the system as I'm worried about the people that control the system.
And I want to use for a subject this morning is, bad things happen to good people.
Amen.
Bad things happen to good people.
Nobody in the state of Alabama, governor, lieutenant governor, senators, have had the decency to say, Mr. Hinton, we're sorry.
I pray to you and my son, Christ Jesus' name.
I truly don't want to believe that they haven't apologized because of the color of my skin. I guess men of power feel that they don't have to apologize to a man of no power.
We've got a political culture where our politicians think that if they say, I'm sorry, that makes them look weak. I actually think being willing to say, I'm sorry when you've made a mistake is how you become strong. You show me 2 people who've been in love for 50 years, I'll show you 2 people who've learned how to apologize to one another, to navigate the hardships, the complexities, to show humility when they offend. And I don't think we've done much thinking about that in this country. I feel like we haven't learned collectively to apologize. And when I think about the courts, I don't think that they're excluded. I think the United States Supreme Court should apologize for its role, its complicity in fostering a society that has excluded, marginalized, and brutalized people of color for 2 centuries. I still believe in the rule of law. I just have come to recognize that we're not going to achieve the justice that we need, the equality we seek, if we stay in the courts alone. The people with power are unwilling to get proximate. They won't do uncomfortable things. I remember when I was a little boy, my grandmother would come up to me and she'd give me these hugs. And she'd squeeze me so tightly, I thought she was trying to hurt me. My grandmother would see me an hour later and she'd say, Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you? And if I said no, she would jump on me again. She wanted me to understand what proximity can mean, how it can empower you. My grandmother was an expert in fostering reflection. And because she was the daughter of enslaved people, she understood the power of narrative. Her father would talk to her every day about what he went through as an enslaved person. And she had these various strategies and tactics for getting me to understand things. One of the things she did when I was younger, she said, we're gonna go to Bowling Green, Virginia. She said, bring your best suit. We got down there, it was the middle of the summer, a hot day. We start walking down this dirt road. I said, Mama, where are we going? She said, don't worry. We got to this field and there was a shack in the middle of the field. And she said, we're gonna go inside this shack, and when we go inside this shack, you're gonna hear something. I said, okay. I was standing in there, and I couldn't hear anything. And then I noticed that my grandmother was crying. I'd never seen her cry before. And when she started crying, I started crying. She squeezed my hand, and she said, stop crying. I said, but I didn't hear anything. She said, yes, you did. I said, no, Mama, I didn't hear anything. She said, yes, you did. I moved to Montgomery in part because that's where the courts were. At the time when I moved here, I didn't know about the history of the slave trade. This was a community shaped by slavery. And when I started realizing that, things began to change. I'll sometimes walk down to the river, which was a portal for the domestic slave trade. And I was sitting down there one day thinking about my grandmother. That shack was the slave cabin where her father was born. And all of a sudden, sitting there, it felt like I could hear the sounds of enslaved people coming into that river. And I understood what my grandmother was teaching me. I can hear it. When I go into jails and prisons, there's a sound. And it's the sound of suffering. It's the sound of agony. It's the sound of misery. And when you hear that misery, when you understand that, it will push you to do things that you won't otherwise be able to do. There's a history of untold cruelty that hides in silence in this country. And I think there are things we can hear in these spaces that can motivate us.
We are so thrilled that so many of you are here. We think something really important has to happen in this country. We think we've got to change the narrative when it comes to race and racial inequality. I don't believe that people who live in Alabama, I don't think that people who live in America are free. We're going to ask you to do something brave today. We're going to ask you to go to lynching sites and bear witness. We're going to ask you to go to lynching sites and recover a part of this history that has been hidden. We're going to give you jars, and we're going to ask you to go to these sites and to put the soil in the jar and to honor and remember the lives of these victims lost. When you go into these sites, sometimes they're uncomfortable. They're places that feel very desolate. They're places that feel even a little menacing. And so it is, in many ways, an act of courage and bravery to go back and do it.
On January 2nd, 1901, a black man named Louis McAdams was lynched near Wilsonville. Mr. McAdams had been accused of attempting to murder a prominent white merchant. The vast majority of documented lynched victims never had a chance to stand trial for their alleged crimes. And like Mr. McAdams, took the presumption of innocence with them to the grave.
When we bring these jars of soil into a space like this and we put them on display, we just make tangible, we make visible this history of terror and suffering. And we would resurrect the lives of these people who have been forgotten, who were never honored, who were never protected. When I see the jar, it tells its own story. There's a variation in color down on the Gulf Coast where it's sandy and light, in the Black Belt where it's really dark and rich, in the northern part where the clay is red. There's this geographic story, but there's also a story about our history. There's sweat in that soil, the sweat of enslaved people. There are the tears of people who suffered when they were being brutalized and lynched. There's the blood of these victims. But there's also hope in that soil. People say to me, why do you want to talk about all these bad things? I don't want to hear about Native genocide. I don't want to hear about slavery. I don't want to hear about lynching. I don't want to hear about segregation. I don't want to hear about all that bad stuff. I think there is a need for a cultural movement that pushes us to remember more. For me, it is about truth-telling in a way that is designed to get us to remember. And not just remember for memory's sake, but get us to remember so that we can recover, we can restore, we can fight to claim a different future.
So there are a few things that we think have to happen in this country that have not happened. In South Africa, there was a recognition that after apartheid, they could not recover without truth and reconciliation. In Rwanda, there is a recognition that there won't be recovery without truth and reconciliation. If you go to Germany today, you can't go 100 meters in Berlin, Germany, without seeing markers or stones or things that have been put in the ground to mark the places where Jewish families were abducted and taken to the concentration camps. The Germans actually want you to go to Auschwitz and reflect soberly on the history of the Holocaust. In this country, we do the opposite.
We're living in a region where the landscape is littered with the iconography of the Confederacy. When I look around and I see the iconography of the glory of enslavement and the era of lynching, I say we're not a very healthy place. And a lot of it emerged in the 1950s when people are talking about civil rights. This cultural movement was designed to make it feel like it was every white person's duty to fight against integration.
And why did you come out of school?
Because I'm not going to school with niggers.
I don't think we've done a very good job in this country of understanding how vast and intense the opposition to civil rights was.
We don't want no niggers. We don't want no niggers in school with us.
I think the civil rights community won the legal battle, but the narrative battle was won by people who were allowed to hold on to this view that there are differences between people who are black and people who are white. And that's why I think this narrative of racial difference survived the civil rights era. I think we have to pay attention to the narrative battle. We've got to do better at creating a narrative that pushes us into a new place. I don't think we've created many places in America where we tell the history of slavery, or the history of lynching, the history of segregation, in a way that motivates everybody, black, white, brown, young, old, to feel inspired to say, never again. And that's the genesis behind this effort that we're now engaged in, to build a memorial and to build a museum. We divide the museum into eras. You have era 1, which is on slavery, era 2, which is on lynching, era 3, which is on segregation, and era 4 on mass incarceration. We call this a narrative museum because on this wall, we actually present a thesis, a story about the history of racial inequality in America. I want there to be repair in this country, not just for communities of color that have been victimized by bigotry and discrimination. I want it to be for all of us. I don't think we can get free until we're willing to tell the truth about our history. I do believe in truth and reconciliation. I just think that truth and reconciliation is sequential, that you can't have the reconciliation without the truth. I feel like we're doing something important in Montgomery. It is a place where if we can show that truth can set us free, that means we can probably do it anywhere.
Thank you. You know, my grandmother died when I was in college. It was before I made any decision to go to law school. And I think if my grandmother gave me anything, she gave me the confidence to believe things I haven't seen. I'd never met a lawyer before. I certainly never met a black lawyer before. So I had to believe I could be one, even though I had never seen one. We had to believe we could create an institution that could help condemned prisoners in a state that was very hostile to condemned prisoners. We had to believe we could build a museum and create a national memorial that honors thousands of victims of lynchings, even though there wasn't really precedent for that.
Tonight, we are taking this broken history, this denial of inequality and injustice, and we're trying to do something with it. Montgomery is not a perfect place. It's a broken place because we haven't done all the things we need to do to get to justice, but I am persuaded tonight that we can do it. And tonight, I want you to join us in making the beginning of this movement, this legacy museum, this memorial for peace and justice, more than a monument, more than a statue, more than a place. We want you to help us make it a movement. We want to create something that is lasting and changing, and we believe tonight that if we believe in freedom, if we believe in love, we can create a more just society. I want to thank all of you for being with us, standing with us, fighting for us, but mostly staying with us as we try to create a better tomorrow.
God, we want every heart, every spirit, every mind, every soul that walks through this place to remember. But we don't want them to just remember, we want them to be inspired. We want them to have hope. We want them to have courage. We want them to have faith. When they leave this place, we want grace and mercy and love to order their steps. Thank you. God bless you. Please be with us always.
We have a monument for every county in America where a lynching took place. And we have a replica of each of those monuments at the memorial site. And we're asking communities to organize and come and claim their monument and bring it back to their community. There are hundreds of lynchings where thousands of people were complicit, were involved. Those lynchings represent a particular need for communities to say more, to do more, to memorialize these spots, to commit to protecting themselves from that legacy perpetuating racial bias for another generation. I believe we're all more than the worst thing we've ever done. We are a slave state, but we're more than slavers. We are a lynching state, but we're more than lynchers. We're a segregation state, but that's not all we are. The other things we are create an opportunity to do things that are restorative, that are rehabilitative, that are redemptive, that create possibilities of reconciliation and repair. I get frustrated when I hear people talk about how, if I had been living during the time of slavery, of course I would have been an abolitionist. And most people think that if they had been living when mobs were gathering to lynch black people on the courthouse lawn, they would have said something. Everybody imagines that if they were in Alabama in the 1960s, they would have been marching with Dr. King. And the truth of it is, I don't think you can claim that if today you are watching these systems be created that are incarcerating millions of people, throwing away the lives of millions of people, destroying communities, and you're doing nothing. I think there's something better waiting for us in this country than another century of conflict and tension and burden, because we won't face the legacy of our past. I think it's important that we understand all the brutal, all the ugly details, because those are the things that actually give rise to what might allow us to one day claim something really beautiful.
We've been viewed and we've been scorned. We've been talked about, shores you born, but we'll never turn back. No, we'll never turn back until we've all been freed and we have equality. We have hung our heads and cried for all those like Lee who died for you and died for me, died